All right, this one's going to be a relatively short video because really what we're going to talk about is the types of graph we've looked at, and including we're going to add one more, a bar graph, because most students are familiar with those. Using the data that we're given, can we decide which of these 5 different graphs are going to be best for our information? Okay, so there are 5 graphs we're going to look at. Bar graph, that's a new one that we didn't talk much about, but we've looked at it and we discussed it back with our line plot. That it shows numbers in specific categories. Really the key being the idea of the specific category. It can be qualitative data, so not numerically based. A box plot, which shows the measure of variation set of data, also is very useful to do very large graph points and variations. That's what we're looking at. A frequency chart, or a histogram shows frequency over equal intervals, how often something happens over different intervals. So for example, I might have the different generations, how many different children they have, or how many buy a house, or things like that. So those kind of things. The line graph, I could show change over time. We talked about that just very recently. And the last one, we want to see a line plot, shows me how many times each number occurs. So it gives us specific data. So we're going to be looking at our data and going, okay, which of these 5 types would be best to create, would be the best view or way to measure our data. So let's start with just looking at some graphs. Which graph tells us where we can get our mode? Can we find mode from box and whisker, or a box plot, or from a line plot? And while I can find all my measures of variation from a box plot, I cannot find mode. Mode's going to only be found by using a line plot. So if I'm asking mode, I want to be sure I'm looking at a line plot for that data. My next question, well, you try me. You tell me which of these would show that if there's an increase or a decrease in injuries since 2006. All right, so let's stop and look. Data has the same amount of information. But if you look over here, they both have the same data. But down here, we don't know what year it happened. We just know how many injuries on the football team. So the change in time, we definitely want to look at our line graph. After that, let's take a look at now, if I've got just state data, not a graph itself, this table shows the first choice variance from the last lesson about the different shampoos. Select an appropriate type of graph that I might use to find this. Well, it does have numbers, but the numbers aren't repeating, so I don't want to use a line plot. It doesn't show change over time. It doesn't show intervals of data. So I'm down to a bar graph or a box plot. Well, I'm not asked for variation. It's not very large data points. So really what I'm looking at is this is going to be best on a bar graph because it's very specific categories and how many in each category. All right, take a look at this one and see if you can figure out what you would do to create this type of graph, or what type of graph you would use to graph this information. All right, and if you said it was a line graph, you are correct. And really the whole reason is we want to see compare, so change over time. So really whenever you see a line graph, anything you're looking for change over time. Now if I'm not looking for time or change, I might be able to use a different kind of graph, okay? If I just want to know how many injuries, what's the most common amount of injuries for a team, or what's the most common amount of students in the orchestra, I probably want to use a different graph. All right, now what I want you to do is actually use this information. This is the one we said you would create a bar graph. I want you to pause the video, create a bar graph. Remember the 5 things you need: labels for X and Y, your title, your scale, and your data. Okay, so pause the video and then see what you come up with, and then you can hit play and you'll see my graph. All right, now that you've had time to create yours, here's what mine would look like. Now yours doesn't have to match mine exactly. I have my bar graph, I've got my labels, brands, shampoo by label, that's my title, responses. I chose to scale it by 10 because I think that still got my information across. I could have chosen 5, I could have chosen 8, I could have chosen a bunch of different numbers. I probably wouldn't want to choose 1, and I probably wouldn't want to choose like 20. The data would be so compact you couldn't see the information. So I chose 10, and that gave me a pretty good scale, okay? So you can see all my data. What I want you to do now, we're going to do the same thing. Now you said earlier, you said this was going to be a line graph. Okay, so now I want you to create that line graph and see what it would look like. Before we jump on, there's this little mark. We learned about it last lesson. This just shows a jump in time. If this is 0, if you see this on the bottom of a graph, those little jagged lines, you're going to say, okay, that's just going to jump in time for scale. I don't have to start at 0 and go up by the same amount every time. I could kind of take a break in the scale. Okay, so pause the video and see what you come up with for your line graph. All right, so this is what I came up with. I've got my students on the side, my years on the bottom, my students in orchestra is my label, but I went ahead, like I said, I jumped the scale. I said 20, 22, 24, 26, 28. Now I could have it a different number, and I could have gone up by 5s, but that would have crunched my data right here in these 3 points, in 22, 20, and 23. It might have been hard to see the change. So I went ahead and went by a smaller scale because my range is only 6. From top 28 to 22, and I used this little mark so I didn't have to number by 2 all the way up from 0 to get my scale to work. All right, so if you have questions, please feel free to reach out, but you have a good handle on choosing the appropriate graphs. If you have questions, I'd be happy to help. Have a great day.